Okay, let's get into this. We are doing a deep dive today into, well, a really radical document. It's a piece of writing that doesn't just critique modern psychology. It actually tries a complete philosophical, even historical overhaul of how we define autism, empathy, and even time itself.
It's quite something.
Yeah. So the mission today is clear. We're exploring this core argument that autistic empathy isn't some kind of deficit. Instead, it's presented as a fundamental human quality that's been, and this is their phrase, stolen, misread, and weaponized, mostly by systems kind of obsessed with linear progress.
Right.
We're going straight into what they call the autistic counter-canon. It basically dismisses all that deficit language and argues for this deep, ongoing continuity of being.
And to really follow this source, you kind of have to adopt its way of seeing things right from the start. It's very heavy on metaphor. The text itself insists that the usual clinical language, the language of deficit, it's just, well, it's too narrow. It can't hold the argument. So we need to grasp these three key symbols that really guide this whole redefinition. First, there's the Stone-Borne matristic world. That's like the deep cyclical past. Second, you have the railway. That's the big symbol for violent linear disruption, conquest, progress, that kind of thing. And third, the lions of Tsavo. They represent the subject who gets completely misread, the being that's demonized, when actually it's the one being intruded upon. These are basically the tools we need to navigate this whole deep dive.
That completely reframes the starting point, doesn't it? Because we're not kicking off with the DSM here. We're starting way back with history, or maybe even prehistory. Let's enter this before this Stone-Borne world. The source described it as the time before all these categories and conquests got imposed, a time where maybe an older, more continuous form of human existence was the norm. They use this really evocative phrase, solitary foragers. But the paradox is key. Solitary, but never actually alone. Life was defined by this deep attunement to like the subtle language of rivers, the way the wind shifts, the need to listen to the chorus of trees. It wasn't about commanding nature, more like dwelling within its rhythm.
And this brings us to a really crucial, maybe complex concept the source calls autistic temporality. We're so conditioned to see time as, you know, an arrow. It starts, moves forward, conquers, ends.
Linear progress.
Exactly. But the Stone-Borne world, according to this text, operated on cycles. Time was patterned, it was reciprocal, it was recursive, always turning back on itself. This demanded a profound kind of foresight and memory.
Wait, can we pause on that for a sec? Autistic temporality, what does that actually look like? And why does the source connect it to this ancient past specifically?
Well, it required something the text calls a teleology of patience. Think about it. Most goals in our world are short-term, right? Quarterly results, 5-year plans.
Yeah.
But in this Stone-Borne world, the goals were measured in like epochs. The slow tilt of the moon, the return of a specific star maybe generations later. Knowledge wasn't just for immediate use. It was planted, maybe literally or figuratively, so a cycle could complete itself decades down the line, carried forward by people maybe not even born yet. It's a deep kind of temporal trust in the pattern.
Wow. Okay.
And the connection to the modern autistic experience, the source argues, is right there. That resistance to sudden, jarring change, the intense focus on systems and patterns, the capacity for incredibly long-term focus. They're saying that's not a bug, it's a feature. It's a remnant of an ancestral way of being, built for a cyclical reality.
So if life is built on these slow cycles, this deep trust, then empathy. It's not just a personality trait anymore, is it? It becomes the essential survival tool. It is, like the source puts it, the air itself.
Exactly, not something you score high or low on.
It's more like an embodied resonance.
Yeah.
A feature of the whole living system. Your survival, the group survival, depended on this absolute quiet cooperation. Not just with people, but the environment too.
Yeah.
You had to know that suffering or joy somewhere else in the web would ripple back to you.
And you couldn't command that cooperation. It had to be sort of offered naturally. This wasn't hyper empathy or deficient empathy in our terms. It was just the necessary awareness of being part of a continuous living whole.
Okay.
So the present day autistic experience in this view gets redefined. It's not a new thing, not an anomaly. It's this older way persisting, the clarity, the focus on fundamental justice, the refusal to just dismiss systemic harm that's seen as the inheritance of that Stone-Borne attunement, an inheritance that just didn't fit when the world changed track.
And that's the perfect transition, isn't it? The change of tracks. Here comes the conflict.
Yeah.
The arrival of the trackers. The source is the patience, the cyclical nature of the Stone-Borne world that gets shattered when empires arrive. And what do they bring? Straight edges and their clocks.
Yeah, the railway metaphor.
Exactly. Forcing this deep, patterned, cyclical life onto a single, straight, linear path. Conquest and progress.
Yeah.
And the core argument here is, well, it's pretty chilling. Anything that exists outside that straight line, outside their order, has to be forced onto it. Or it's labeled deficient and ultimately has to be destroyed.
And this isn't presented just as some abstract metaphor for colonialism, though it is that too. The source actually grounds it in specific historical acts. It talks about how kinship ties, community empathy were deliberately targeted and rebranded as problems. The genocide of the Gaels is one example cited, where these deep systemic connections were systematically broken down, fidelity to cycles, to family, to place that was labeled backwardness, an obstacle to be cleared for industrial progress. And the Tsavo lions analogy, it really drills down into the psychological mechanism of this theft. The lions became man-eaters, symbols of evil, this external threat. But the source forces you to ask, hang on, who are the real intruders here? It was the railway, the straight line of progress. It broke the ecosystem, starved the lions, and basically created the very crisis the lions were then blamed and demonized for.
Wow, okay. So the railway is the physical intrusion.
Yes.
And then philosophy and psychology become the intellectual trackers. Once the physical tracks are laid, you need the intellectual framework to justify them.
Precisely. That elemental empathy we talk about, that visceral sense of justice, the uncompromising demand for fairness, it couldn't just be left alone. It had to be recoded. It didn't fit the metrics, so it got translated into clinical language. Rule following, rigidity, maybe social deficit.
So what was once this deep systemic resonance gets reduced to cold linear measurements. Like how well do you do on a false belief test? Can you decode theory of mind fast enough? If you can't navigate the colonizer's social maze effectively.
The assumption isn't that the maze is flawed.
No, the assumption is that you are flawed. You're lacking something.
Exactly. And the text really hammers this point. The trackers always frame the story like they're the ones in danger. The lions are the problem, the anomaly. But just like those lions, the source argues the autistic person isn't the intruder. They're the ones being intruded upon. And their essential nature is what the trackers feel they must pathologize or destroy to make their straight line seem like the only way, the natural way.
Which leads us right into the present-day situation, described as the fractured one on the tracks. This individual is marked, often simultaneously, as an anomaly, a specimen, a threat, and also a lack. It's a terrible double bind.
Yeah, it's depicted as incredibly painful.
The empathy is still there, apparently. But it's described as overwhelming, a flood. The source uses this phrase, the roar of lions inside my chest. Yet when the trackers, the psychologists, the philosophers write their reports, this flood gets recorded as absence, as lack. The clarity they possess is called pathology. What's whole in them gets labeled as broken.
And this context is absolutely essential to understand the source's critique of philosophy. It doesn't just go after those seeking elimination or cure. It also critiques the defenders, pointing specifically to philosophers like Kennett, Cron, and Fenton.
Wait, hang on. It criticizes people who are trying to defend autistic people? Why would it do that?
Because, and this is the absolute crux of it, the defense accepted the poacher's premise. That's the key phrase. These philosophers, they saw the moral integrity, right? They saw something valuable. And they tried to argue for that moral worth, even if, as they assumed, autistic people lacked standard empathy. They accepted the diagnosis of deficit as real.
Ah, I see.
They tried to build a case for dignity, but they did it within the framework established by the trackers, within the railway's logic. They basically said, okay, they might lack this thing we measure, this specific metric, but they're still valuable. They mistook the railway's cut through the landscape for the natural shape of the land itself.
So the source is saying, any argument that starts by accepting the premise of deficit can never actually lead to real dignity or understanding.
That's exactly it. By accepting the validity of the measure, they inadvertently legitimize the original the theft of the very concept of empathy, redefining it in the tracker's narrow terms.
Wow, that's a really sharp distinction. The fight isn't about proving you can pass the test. It's about questioning whether the test itself, the whole framework, is even valid.
Precisely. And as you'd expect, the critique is even harsher for those figures who promote elimination or cure. People like Simon Baron-Cohen or RFK the Lesser are mentioned. The source portrays them as wanting to dismantle an engine for its useful parts. They might admire certain outputs, the intense focus, the logical or mathematical skills some autistic people have. But they want those traits without the actual people, without the neurotype itself. They see the core neurology as a disease needing a cure, even while valuing its products. They look at the neurotype and see only cure, only absence. They treat the living person almost like a resource to be strip-mined. And the source warns, if you eradicate that stone patience, that deep systemic awareness, you actually destroy the very clarity that enabled the math or the focus in the first place. You can't just take the bits you like.
Okay, so if we pull this segment together, the fundamental violence isn't just the conclusion, oh, autistic people lack empathy. It's the entire process.
Yeah.
Being treated as an object of study, needing external validation from philosophers or psychologists for your basic moral worth. Having your natural way of caring, your empathy, rendered invalid until it's translated into the colonizer's tongue, that analytic paraphrase.
Yes. And that's precisely why the response, the counter-argument, has to be story and metaphor. It's presented as the only way to escape the confines of that straight line. The source is adamant. The language of deficit cannot hold us.
So where does that leave us? What does the future look like if the language of deficit is rejected?
The source pivots quite beautifully, I think, to this idea of the first child of the next world, born beyond the tracks. For this imagined child, empathy isn't something debated or tested in a lab. It just is. It's the air she breathes. She's genuinely confused, bewildered by the idea that anyone would try to weigh care on a scale, use metrics, or mistake that internal roar of justice for silence. She moves naturally with that autistic temporality, knowing it is wisdom, not some kind of delay or deficit. She just doesn't get the cruelty of needing to explain your moral core in analytic paraphrase.
This child symbolizes that uncolonized potential, right? The horizon where the autistic counter-canon is being written. It's described as a text being assembled between worlds, gathering up all the pieces the poachers tried to scatter and deny. It's a fundamental refusal of the hunter's narrative.
It insists on wholeness, on continuity. It brings together the deep stone patience, the necessary lion defiance, and that absolute child's astonishment that anyone could look at such depth and see only absence.
So the message is, the lie, the deficit narrative, it was never inevitable. And the future, the after, is already being shaped. By choosing to move in cycles, by pausing for moons, by remembering that deep patience and attunement the trackers forgot when they were just focused on laying their straight railway line.
And the final claim, which is incredibly powerful, is about ownership. Empathy, the source concludes, fundamentally belongs to the autistic community. It's framed as an inheritance from that continuous matristic past. It was never the tracker's right to define it, let alone measure it and find it lacking. They mistook its flood, its systemic nature, its sheer depth for absence, and simply because their tools, their straight edges and clocks couldn't contain it, couldn't measure it.
This just flips the whole script, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The perceived lack of empathy isn't presented as a failure within the neurotype at all. It's cast as a failure of the entire surrounding world's measurement system. The railway, the metrics, the analytic paraphrase, the whole thing. It becomes a story of inheritance, of persistence, not anomaly or deficit.
Exactly, a continuity.
So what does this mean for you listening to this? If our basic understanding of huge human concepts like empathy, morality, even time itself is so deeply intertwined with these straight lines of conquest and linear progress, it really forces a challenging question, doesn't it? What other human qualities, what are the ways of being or experiencing the world are we currently defining as a deficit or a pathology, simply because they operate on cycles or resonate systemically or just can't be neatly measured by the linear tools our current culture happens to value? Something to think about.